Let me tell you something today. There is a reason why the Sabbath shakes the kingdom of darkness. The Sabbath creates the fear of God, not just in us, but in the powers of this world that try to erase his authority. When you pause on the seventh day, when you stop chasing, stop striving, and surrender your time to the one who made heaven and earth, you are making a bold declaration. God is God, and I am not. He is creator, and I am his creation. That reverence, that holy fear, is what keeps us grounded in truth. The fear of God is not terror. It is awe. It is reverence. It is the trembling awareness that he holds our breath, our heartbeat, and our future in his hands. And the Sabbath was given to keep that awareness alive. Every seventh day, we step back from our own ambitions, our own power, our own pride, and we recognize that all authority belongs to him. That is why the Sabbath is so offensive to Babylon, because it reminds the world that we cannot own time. We cannot rewrite truth. We cannot dethrone God. When you honor the Sabbath, you put fear into the enemy's camp, because you are living proof that there are still people who bow to God's authority instead of man's systems. The Sabbath is a mirror reflecting who is really in charge. It silences human arrogance and amplifies divine glory. It is a sign that God is the Alpha and the Omega, and that one day every knee will bow. The fear of God born in the Sabbath is not about cowering. It is about courage. It's the kind of fear that makes you bold enough to stand against compromise, strong enough to resist temptation, and faithful enough to endure persecution. When the world sees you resting on the Sabbath, even when it costs you something, they see a testimony that your loyalty cannot be bought. That kind of obedience plants fear in the hearts of those who oppose God, because it shows them that heaven's authority is greater than earth's power. So never underestimate the power of Sabbath. It is not just a day, it is a declaration. It creates reverence in the hearts of the faithful and resistance in the face of evil. The Sabbath is God's reminder to fear him, to worship him, and to give him glory. And let me tell you, when you keep the Sabbath, you are preparing your soul for eternity, because in the end the final call will be fear God and give glory to him and worship him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of water. The Sabbath reveals God's authority over time. When God created the world, he did not only shape matter, light, and life. He also created time itself. Each day of creation marked an unfolding of divine purpose. And when the seventh day arrived, God sanctified it. He placed his own presence into that span of time, blessing it and making it holy. This was not just an act of rest, but an eternal declaration that time belongs to him. The Sabbath reveals God's authority over time, reminding every generation that the clock does not belong to kings, empires, or human systems. It belongs to the Creator of heaven and earth. Every time we honor the Sabbath, we are stepping into God's order of time. We are confessing with our actions that he alone holds the past, the present, and the future. Unlike earthly rulers who can claim land or build monuments, only God has the power to sanctify time. Human hands can shape stone or forge nations, but they cannot touch time. Yet God reached into the weekly cycle and carved out a day that would forever testify of his authority. That means when we stop on the seventh day, we are recognizing not just his creative power, but his dominion over history itself. This is why the Sabbath is so powerful and so contested. If humanity can be convinced to forget it, then they forget who controls time. The Sabbath exposes the lie that we are masters of our own destiny, or that we can stretch our lives by working endlessly. It reminds us that breath, strength, and existence itself flow from God's hand. It humbles us because no matter how advanced civilization becomes, no one can erase or replace the sanctity of the seventh day. It is God's signature stamped into time itself, untouched by man, untouchable by governments, and unchanged by century. When we enter into the Sabbath, we are aligning with God's eternal authority. We are declaring that time is not just a cycle of work and sleep, but a gift designed to bring us back to the Creator. The Sabbath resets our perspective, pulls us out of the rush of earthly demands, and anchors us in eternal reality. It reveals that while men may control schedules, deadlines, and economies, God alone controls destiny. To acknowledge His Sabbath is to acknowledge His kingship over every moment of our existence. The authority of God over time also carries a prophetic weight. In Revelation, the call to fear God and give glory to Him is tied directly to worshiping the one who made the heavens, the earth, the seas, and the fountains of waters. That language pulls us back to the fourth commandment, the Sabbath command, which identifies God as creator. In the end, the battle will not just be about worship in general. It will be about who holds authority over time and loyalty. The Sabbath will stand as God's eternal claim, His reminder that while Babylon may demand allegiance, time itself bears witness to the Creator. This authority should move us to reverence. When the Sabbath comes each week, it is as if God is standing at the door of time, inviting us to step into His presence. To accept that invitation is to acknowledge Him as Lord of time, and to reject it is to place ourselves under the illusion of self-rule. But man cannot rule time. We cannot add a second to our life or take away a day. We are stewards, not owners. The Sabbath forces us to confront that truth and to live in holy awe of the one who controls the ticking of the clock. Therefore, to keep the Sabbath is to walk in recognition of God's eternal authority. It is not merely about ceasing from work. It is about honoring the one who sanctified time itself. It is a declaration that no man, no system, and no power can claim what God has already sealed. The Sabbath reveals that He is Lord of creation, Lord of history, and Lord of eternity. Week after week, it is a proclamation that our times are in His hands. The Sabbath inspires reverence and awe. When the Sabbath arrives, it is not just another day sliding into the weekly cycle. It is a holy interruption, a divine pause that pulls our hearts upward and reminds us that life is not about endless striving, but about worshiping the one who gave us breath. The Sabbath inspires reverence and awe because it carries God's own presence. From the very beginning, when God blessed and sanctified the seventh day, He marked it as different, holy, and set apart. That holiness was not man-made, nor was it the product of culture or tradition. It was God Himself placing His glory on time. When we step into the Sabbath, we step into something sacred, and the only fitting response is awe. Think about it. The same God who spoke galaxies into existence, who stretched the heavens like a curtain, and who breathed life into man, chose to rest on the seventh day. He did not rest because He was tired, but because He was establishing a pattern of holiness for His creation. The God of infinite power laid down a rhythm of worship and reverence, teaching us that holiness is not only about what we do, but about how we honor Him with our time. Every Sabbath, that lesson comes alive. Every Sabbath, creation echoes with the reminder that the Maker is worthy of our wonder. Reverence is not just about silence in a sanctuary or bowing our heads in prayer. It is about recognizing who God is and responding with the posture of our hearts. The Sabbath teaches us reverence because it demands that we set aside our own agenda and honor God. The world pushes us to keep moving, producing, consuming, and chasing. But the Sabbath says, stop, be still, remember your Creator. That call strips away our pride and places us face to face with the Almighty. In that space, we begin to see Him not just as a distant God, but as the Holy King of the universe, who calls us into His presence. The awe of the Sabbath is also rooted in its beauty. It is a day when families gather, when songs of praise rise, when creation itself seems to exhale. It is a taste of eternity, a reminder of Eden, and a preview of heaven. When we light candles, open the scriptures, or lift our voices in prayer on the Sabbath, we are joining a chorus that has been echoing since the dawn of time. Angels honor it, creation reflects it, and the redeemed find joy in it. To participate in that eternal rhythm is to be overwhelmed with gratitude and awe. But the Sabbath does more than inspire quiet reverence. It inspires holy boldness. When we recognize God's authority and holiness through the Sabbath, we are strengthened to live differently in a world that mocks sacred things. We are reminded that we belong to a kingdom that is not of this world. That reverence fuels courage, because when we truly fear God, we no longer fear man. The Sabbath becomes both a shield and a song, protecting us from the noise of Babylon and lifting us into the worship of heaven. In the end, the Sabbath is about relationship. It is not simply a doctrine to be debated or a rule to be kept. It is an appointment with the Almighty. It is God saying, I want you to know me, to experience my presence, to walk in my holiness. That invitation should leave us in awe. The Creator of all things has chosen to meet with His children week after week, to renew their hearts, to restore their spirits, and to remind them that they are His. When we truly grasp that, the only response is reverence, the only posture is worship, and the only song is awe. The Sabbath is holy because God is holy, and when we honor it, we stand in the very presence of His majesty. The Sabbath exposes human pride. The Sabbath stands as a mirror, reflecting back to us the reality of our own weakness and the limits of our pride. Human nature is bent towards self-exaltation. We boast in our achievements, cling to our schedules, and measure our worth by what we produce. The world around us reinforces this illusion, teaching us that rest is laziness and that value comes only from endless labor. Yet the Sabbath cuts across that lie with divine authority. It declares that we are not in control, that time does not belong to us, and that we are creatures dependent upon the Creator. That truth dismantles pride because it forces us to surrender the illusion of self-sufficiency and acknowledge the God who holds our very breath. Pride whispers, I don't need anyone else. I can manage my own life. I can work 7 days without stopping and still get ahead. But the Sabbath interrupts that arrogance with a command to stop, to rest, and to remember. It is not a suggestion, nor is it simply a healthy lifestyle habit. It is God's holy appointment, a day written into the very fabric of creation. Every time we obey the Sabbath, we confess that we are not gods of our own time. We bow before the one who ordered the universe, who alone has authority to sanctify a day. This obedience humbles us, stripping away the pretense that we are the masters of our destiny. The Sabbath also exposes pride by revealing how stubbornly we resist God's gift. Many people scoff at the idea of stopping their labor, claiming they are too busy or too important to pause. Yet in that refusal lies the essence of pride, the belief that our plans outweigh God's command. When Pharaoh refused to let Israel rest, it was pride that hardened his heart. He saw the Sabbath as a threat to his power, because he knew that a people who rested in God would no longer bow to human oppression. The same is true today. Pride resists rest, because rest is surrender to God's authority. There is a reason the Sabbath is hated by Babylon and resisted by the proud. It unmasks the truth about human nature and exposes the emptiness of self-worship. When we keep the Sabbath, we proclaim that our lives are not built on our own strength, but on God's grace. We remind the world that our identity is not defined by our titles, bank accounts, or achievements, but by the fact that we belong to the Creator. That humility is deeply offensive to the proud, because it tears down every idol of sin. Yet it is precisely that humility that leads to freedom, peace, and joy. Even in worship, pride can creep in. We may be tempted to boast in our holiness, our knowledge, or our devotion, but the Sabbath silences such arrogance by reminding us that holiness is not earned, it is received. The day is holy not because of what we do, but because of what God has already done. We simply enter into it. That truth humbles us, reminding us that salvation itself is a gift, not a wage. The Sabbath becomes a weekly sermon, preaching against the pride that lurks in every human heart. In the end, the Sabbath is not only a call to rest, but a call to repent. It demands that we lay down our pride, our striving, our illusions of control, and our endless need to prove ourselves. It invites us to enter a rhythm where God is at the center and we are His children, dependent and beloved. The Sabbath strips away arrogance and replaces it with gratitude. It dismantles self-worship and replaces it with God worship. And when pride is exposed, healing begins. The Sabbath humbles us so that we can stand in awe of the Creator, not of ourselves. It breaks us so that God's Spirit can restore us. And in that humility, we find true freedom. The Sabbath strikes fear into the enemy. The Sabbath is not just a quiet day of worship and rest. It is a weapon of spiritual warfare, that shakes the kingdom of darkness to its core. From the beginning of time, the Sabbath has stood as God's mark upon his people, a sign that they belong to him and not to the powers of this world. That is why the enemy hates it with such intensity. Every time a believer keeps the Sabbath, it is not a small act of religious devotion, but a bold declaration of allegiance to the Creator and a rejection of Babylon's authority. This is why the Sabbath strikes fear into the enemy, because it is a living testimony that Satan has lost his claim over humanity. The devil's entire agenda is built on rebellion against God's authority. His deception in Eden was an attempt to separate humanity from the Creator's law and to distort the order God established. But the Sabbath stands as an unshakable reminder of God's power in creation and redemption. It cannot be changed, bought, or erased, no matter how many traditions or human decrees are set against it. Every seventh day, like a trumpet sounding through history, the Sabbath proclaims, God is king, and his word is final. That reality terrifies the enemy, because it reveals the futility of his rebellion and reminds him that his time is short. When God's people rest on the Sabbath, they are not simply taking a break from labor, they are waging war. Their rest is an act of resistance against the culture of endless striving, consumerism, and self-exaltation that Satan uses to enslave humanity. In Babylon's system, worth is measured by production and identity by performance. But the Sabbath flips that system upside down. It declares that our worth is not in what we do, but in who we belong to. That defiance of Babylon's values is dangerous to the enemy's kingdom, for it weakens his grip on minds and hearts. The Sabbath is therefore a revolutionary act that reminds Satan he cannot control those who rest in God's authority. The enemy also fears the Sabbath because it carries prophetic weight. Scripture makes clear that the final test of loyalty will center around worship, who we obey and whose authority we acknowledge. The Sabbath is God's seal, the visible sign that his people honor him as Creator and Redeemer. To the enemy, every Sabbath kept in faith is like a prophecy fulfilled, a reminder that there is a remnant who will not bow to his counterfeit system. This is why history shows repeated attempts to erase or replace the Sabbath. The devil knows that if people truly embrace God's Sabbath, they will awaken to their true identity and see through his deceptions. On a personal level, the Sabbath also strikes fear into the enemy, because it restores what he works so hard to destroy: peace, joy, family, and holiness. Satan thrives in chaos, distraction, and exhaustion, but the Sabbath interrupts his attacks by giving God's people space to breathe, to pray, to worship, and to reconnect with their Creator. A rested believer is a dangerous believer, for they are clear-minded, spirit-filled, and unshaken by fear. That is why the enemy fights so hard to keep people busy, distracted, and indifferent to the Sabbath. He knows that if they truly enter into God's rest, they will find strength to resist him. Ultimately, the Sabbath is not just a day, it is a declaration of war against the enemy's lie. It is a banner raised high that announces, we belong to God, not to Babylon. And as long as the Sabbath exists, Satan is reminded of his defeat in creation at the cross, and in the final judgment yet to come. The Sabbath terrifies the enemy because it is living proof that God's people cannot be bought, broken, or deceived. They will rest in their God, and in that rest, they will rise with power. The Sabbath strengthens holy courage. The Sabbath is more than a commandment written in stone. It is a divine appointment that strengthens the heart with holy courage. In a world where fear, compromise, and conformity dominate, the Sabbath calls God's people to stand tall, unafraid, and anchored in truth. Each Sabbath is not just a pause from labor, but a spiritual renewal, a reminder that courage does not come from human strength, but from the Creator who set this day apart. When the sun sets on Friday and God's people step into his holy rest, something shifts in the spirit. The noise of the world fades, and in its place comes the quiet confidence that they are not alone, that their God is with them, and that his presence is greater than any power of man or devil. Holy courage is not recklessness. It is not the arrogance of self-will, but the quiet boldness of obedience. The Sabbath trains us in this boldness, for to honor it is to go against the tide of the world. Babylon says, work without rest, earn your worth, follow tradition. But the Sabbath answers, God is my creator, my provider, and my king. I will rest in him even when the world mocks or resists. That kind of faith produces courage, for it forces a believer to live by conviction rather than convenience. Every time one chooses the Sabbath over cultural pressure, it builds the muscle of holy defiance, the same courage that kept Daniel unshaken in Babylon, and the 3 Hebrew boys standing tall before the furnace. The Sabbath also strengthens courage by reminding us of God's victories in the past. Each week it points back to creation, where God spoke and worlds came into being. It whispers of the Exodus, when God freed his people from slavery and commanded them to remember the Sabbath as a sign of freedom. It reflects the cross, where Christ rested in the tomb on the Sabbath before rising victorious over death. And it looks forward to eternity, where the redeemed will worship from one Sabbath to another in the new earth. To rest in the Sabbath is to stand in the stream of God's triumphs. And when you remember that history, how can you not be brave? The same God who created, delivered, and resurrected is the one who calls you to rest in his name. The world is moving toward a final conflict over worship and allegiance, and many will be tested by laws, pressure, and persecution. But the Sabbath has already been preparing God's people for that hour. Each week it calls them to separate from Babylon's system, to choose God even when it is unpopular, to stand apart in loyalty. That weekly practice forms holy courage, the kind that will not bend under threats or yield to compromise. The Sabbath is God's training ground for faithfulness. It is not just about physical rest. It is about spiritual readiness. On a personal level, courage grows when the soul learns to rest in God's promises. The Sabbath is a reminder that we do not fight our battles alone. God himself goes before us, and his presence is our shield. When we gather on Sabbath, sing hymns, pray together, and open his word, something happens inside. Fear is replaced with faith, anxiety with assurance, weakness with strength. The believer leaves the Sabbath not just refreshed, but empowered, ready to face trials with a courage that does not come from within, but from above. So let the Sabbath be your source of holy boldness. Let it teach you to stand when the world bows, to trust when fear whispers, to walk in obedience when compromise calls. Courage is not found in ignoring fear, but in choosing to obey God despite it. In every Sabbath, as heaven draws near to earth, God breathes courage into his people. This holy day reminds them they are chosen, sealed, and strengthened by the one who never loses a battle. That is why the Sabbath is not weakness. It is the source of unshakable strength, the fountain of holy courage that will carry God's people through to the end.